Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for 3040. Today, we're going to discuss psychoanalytical criticism and really focusing on the theme today of uncovering the fictional mind. So, if you've already had psychology classes, you'll know that psychoanalysis is not really a thing anymore, but it's still an important actual application and criticism for literary studies, film studies, and art studies. So let's kind of take a look at the history of psychology throughout kind of ages and then talk about what the theory is. So let's talk about first how the Western world studied the historical mind, right? So the study of mind begins with really the study of the body. So original kind of what we call proto physiological theories for the Western cultures focused on the four temperaments. And so basically, it suggests that there are four fundamental personality types. So we have sanguine, which is pleasure seeking and sociable. We have choleric, which is ambitious, leader like. We have melancholic, which is analytical and quiet. And then we have phlegmatic, relaxed and peaceful. And then there's a much more of course, we'll get into with these four kind of personality types. So, most formations include the possibility of a mixture of these types as well. So, someone could be ambitious but melancholic. Someone could be, phlegmatic but yet sanguine and pleasure-seeking. So, they're based, of course, on parts of the body, right? The fluids of the body. I should say more precisely, but then they go much more into a couple of different kind of dynamics. So let's kind of look a little bit at this. So we are really talking about Greek ideas and so forth when we talk about how the West really started thinking about the mind, in terms of a scientific kind of aspect. It begins with humorism or humoralism, right? And that's the system of medicine detailing the makeup and workings of the human body. And this is where we get the Hippocratic Oath and all that. It's adopted by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. So the premise, adapted from the four temperaments, argues that an excess or deficiency of any four distinct bodily fluids in a person, known as humors or humors, right, depending on where you are in English language countries, directly influence their temperament and health. So again, we have blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, so urine, feces, phlegm, and blood. So it also now gets into a little bit more complicated with these personality types. So there's also an element of course, earth, the four elements of the earth and so forth. And it also gets into even just kind of weather and things. So it tries to kind of figure out, okay, and when you think about it, here's why, right? So, all right, well, it's humid out and things are blooming, so people seem to be more phlegmatic. So they knew there was things going on, right? But they didn't really understand, of course, the real scientific nature of everything. These traits have positives and negatives. So the personality type of sanguine is enthusiastic, active, and social. Sanguines tend to be more extroverted and enjoy being part of a crowd. They find that being social, outgoing, and charismatic is easy. However, they can be overly passionate, letting lust rule them, and so forth. Sanguines have a hard time doing nothing and engage in more risk seeking behavior. These are crucial, especially when you get into the Renaissance period of literature and even medieval literature, because a lot of authors create characters based on the four humors and they really focus just like we do today. Like, okay, so if I'm going to give a character, ADHD or PTSD, right, I'm going to, have a character behave a certain way. The same thing back then, even though they didn't have the complex psychological understanding that we do today, they still tried to understand minds and personalities, and they really constructed characters with these four humors in mind. Choleric individuals, again, tend to be more extroverted. They're independent, decisive, goal oriented. They enjoy being in charge of a group. That's where their ambition and leadership skills come from. And they also have usually a logical or fact based outlook on the world. However, of course, too much makes them excessively aggressive and quick to anger, right? So they could be a good leader, but they are a bad decision maker. And so it's, again, when you think about it, it's still what we do today with a lot of like personality types based on like internet surveys and things, but they connected it to, of course, the body directly. Melancholic individuals tend to be more analytical, detail oriented, deep thinking, feelers, empathetic. They're introverted. So already we're seeing kind of that opposition, right, with a couple of the personality types. And then they usually avoid being singled out in a crowd, right? They like to stay by themselves. They tend to be self-reliant, thoughtful, reserved, and tidy. And think about this. So, these are so general, but they could fit specific people, and they could even fit yourself, which is why they made sense at the time, right? However, melancholic people are anxious. They obsess over details, making them perfectionists and capable of finishing tasks, right? Many of my artist friends could fit into this category. They will often become depressed easily and incapable of action when in a depressed state. And then the phlegmatic individuals tend to be relaxed, peaceful, quiet, easygoing. They're sympathetic and care about others, yet try to hide their emotions. Phlegmatic characters also are good at generalizing ideas or problems to the world and making compromises. The issue, though, is they could be too lackadaisical and lead, which could, of course, make them apathetic. So, obviously, we don't have these personality traits connected to these humors anymore, but you could see when you start investigating literature that there are, especially during, again, the Renaissance and Restoration, even, there are a lot of characters that will fit into these molds because the authors were using this idea as a guiding point for peoples and personalities. So, the psychological field as a scientific study, of course, people associated with Freud, but it actually starts a little bit before, right? And of course, again, Freud with his studies on hysteria really begins psychology as a scientific field as we know it, but it really emerges before in the 1840s. One of the most crucial figures is Alexander Bain, and he originates a crucial theory called the psychophysical parallelism, which argues that the mind and body experiences sensation simultaneously. Probably seems obvious to us, but crucial and radical for the time. Although the mind and body are independent phenomena, they cannot be separated from each other. So, Bain proposed that all knowledge and all mental functions are based on actual physical sensations and not on spontaneous thoughts and ideas. Again, seems pretty clear, but radical for the time. And this is what solidifies psychology as a scientific field by applying, and this is what's important, Bain applied the scientific method to uncover mental processes. So he was like, get rid of those, humors. Let's look at how the mind and body function in a scientific way, using, of course, the scientific method. So when we get to psychoanalysis, obviously it does originate from Freud. And the major premise is that the psyche consists of conscious and unconscious spheres that can be met. So Sigmund Freud, the originator of psychoanalysis, believed that readers could unravel subconscious natures of characters. A reader or critic can piece together a character's psyche from clues provided by the text and the author. And this is an important aspect because even though we associate Freud with, psychoanalysis applied to people, therapy sessions, Freud actually wrote much more. Now, for the psychoanalytical basis of Freud's theories, so he divided the mind into the conscious mind, or the ego, and then the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind was then further divided into the id, instincts, drive, and then superego conscious. In this theory, the unconscious refers to the mental processes of which individuals make themselves unaware. So Freud believed that significant psychic events take place below the surface in the unconscious mind, like getting messages from the unconscious. He interpreted such events as having both symbolic and actual significance. Now you see the connection, of course, between what we do as literary scholars, right? Subtext, right? Explication. So he kind of viewed the mind as a text, right? Explicating the text, trying to find and uncover hidden meanings. So you can see why, again, for literature, Freud is still somewhat of a figure that's celebrated it to an extent because of what he was doing with his literary analyses, but of course, totally disregarded for his actual psychoanalytical theories that he applied to real people. So viewed the unconscious as a respiratory for socially unacceptable ideas, wishes, desires, traumatic memories, painful emotions put out by, or should we put out of mind, right, by the mechanics and mechanisms of psychoanalytical repression. So typically, people's uncomfortability with sex, for example, sexual thoughts or desires, and sexuality itself is the root cause for many of these ideas, which is why no one views his ideas as really accurate now today. In his view, psychological, disturbances are largely caused by personal conflicts existing in the unconscious level. Again, you'll think of this is why when you read his literary analyses, it's really interesting because personal conflicts, inner conflicts, right? Literature scholars have always talked about that. So when he talks about the literature, it makes a lot of sense. But when he talks about people, it doesn't really fly anymore. So another crucial figure is Carl Gustav Jung. So he took Freud's ideas, further dividing the unconscious into two layers: personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And this idea is still really kind of celebrated by philosophers as well as literary scholars. The personal unconscious is a reservoir of material that was once conscious but has been forgotten, repressed, or suppressed. The collective unconscious, however, is the deepest level of the psyche, containing the accumulation of inherited psychic structures and archetypal experiences. This further goes back to postcolonialism when we talk about inherited trauma. So this is again why this aspect of psychoanalytical theory is still relevant today, and still viewed as relevant and applicable by psychologists today, because Jung, the collective unconscious idea, really fits into those kind of ancestral traumas that a lot of psychologists seem to feel is accurate, right? Because you could kind of scientifically trace things at times. So the archetypes are not memories but images with universal meanings that are apparent in a cultural's use of symbols. So the collective unconscious is the inherited and contains basically the material of an entire species rather than of an individual. Interesting theory again that people still play with today, but it's when you think about, okay, if you're creating a character, if you're looking at how art represents culture, it makes sense why people still apply psychoanalysis. To give you even a further sense of Freud's literary scholarship in The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, Freud asserts that Hamlet's madness merely disguised the truth in the same way dreams disguise unconscious reality. This is where the Oedipus complex comes from. So he really he creates this idea from literature, not from people, which is he applies it to people again, which is inaccurate the way he applies it. But his literary analysis is still highly regarded because it is very complex and it took an angle that no one really thought of yet. So basically, his theory, if you look at his thesis, right, suffering from the Oedipus complex, Hamlet is conflicted because he has repressed sexual desire for his mother, which is being acted out by and challenged by Claudius. Weirdly enough, this interpretation is still kind of celebrated today. Mel Gibson and his interpretation, A.C. Bradley, for example, have used when they performed the play or when they directed the play or acted out the character. They actually, see an interesting kind of dynamic if you create a love interest between Hamlet and his mother, even if it's not reciprocal. So this is why psychoanalysis is still kind of talked about in the literary realms and even in film too, because not only did Freud conduct a lot of literary analysis, for almost 100 years, you see literary scholars, literary artists talk about Freud's theories. So, for example, like Alfred Hitchcock used a lot of his theories, used a lot of Freud's theories to create his movies and characters. So there is an important kind of dynamic when you're researching kind of and applying psychology to literature. The two main elements of literature that psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical critics really explore into really include two important concepts that a lot of artists even played with before: the uncanny and the doppelganger. Again, foil characters, right? So there's a lot of important ideas that we get through the kind of psychoanalytical focal points here. So let's look at this kind of ideas. So Ernest Jens in the on the Psychology of the Uncanny from 1906 analyzes how German writer E.T.A. Hoffmann uses uncanny efforts in his work. So Jens focuses specifically on Hoffman's story, The Sandman, which features a lifelike doll, Olympia, right? So Sigmund Freud, too, in The Uncanny, also draws on the work of Hoffmann. And basically, these works demonstrate how critics attempt to uncover the conscious and unconscious aspects of characters, looking at how the familiar becomes unfamiliar and so forth. Think about all the different kind of horror stories, right, with dolls and things like that are so popular, for example, that are produced by Blumhouse and everything. And you see, again, there's a lot of interesting kind of history behind psychoanalysis and its application in film and literature. So Sigmund Freud defines the uncanny as the class of the frightening which leads back to what is known. It is the unfamiliar that seems familiar. So think of, concepts like deja vu, right? Think of concepts like sense that bring memories. Think of even if you see like a UNCP classmate in Europe, how unsettling it would be at first because it's familiar but yet unfamiliar and so forth. Freud explains that the manifestation of the uncanny as repressed memories trying to emerge. Literary critics, though, are concerned with deconstructing the uncanny as a narrative device, of course, right? How can we use and construct a mood by focusing on the unfamiliar that seems familiar, and why would that be scary? So when we look at, of course, the uncanny, Lacan, which is a crucial figure for psychoanalysis and then, of course, for literature studies, Jacques Lacan in Anxiety argues that the uncanny places us in the field where we do not know how to distinguish bad and good, pleasure from displeasure. Right? So he uses the mirror as an example, and I think hopefully you recognize this. I think all of us at one time do, right? So basically, he uses the mirror since it can produce narcissistic impulses like, man, I look damn good, my hair is awesome, while simultaneously producing dread, right? Oh, what if I look this good? Why am I still single? What will I look like when I'm older? Did I wear the same thing a week ago, right, for the same class? So, what he's trying to discuss with the uncanny is all the multiple layers of why we feel anxious in a regular setting, right? So we could have a moment of ultimate narcissism, ultimate confidence, but then immediately all of a sudden have a feeling that's either overlapping, encroaching, or just parallel with this. Oh my God! Ooh, like if I'm this good, if I'm this sexy, why am I single? And so all of a sudden this feeling of pleasure turns into this feeling of dread. And it's a very interesting kind of concept when you look at how artists and authors use the uncanny effect to create tone, characters, and horror, and so forth. Now, the doppelganger effect, I think we're all familiar with this term, but let's just define it. Again, foil characters, all sorts of things, right? Doppelganger is these kind of important aspect of the similar but yet different kind of idea. So it plays into the uncanny in a lot of ways, but it also helps to show the dynamic of doubling or parallelism, right? So, the think about how Muppets are stars in their own shows, but they appear in advertisements, they exhibit human personalities. Puppets would be a great kind of doppelganger effect where you ever think of kid when you're a kid and stuffed animals like talking to a doll and things like that. It's kind of a weird behavior when you think about it, but yet it's a crucial one. And why do we create fictional characters? Why do we relate to fictional characters? And so all these kind of dynamics are important. So let's take a look at just kind of the overarching ideas. Again, numerous psychologists have debunked Freud's theories, right? But literary and film critics continue to apply contemporary approaches of psychoanalysis and also psychology to dissect characterizations. Psychology offers an important look into how and why authors and directors construct and portray characters, as well as how they function as reflections of people. So, if you're interested in psychology, it is another avenue to connect to literature, and vice versa, right? So, while literary and film critics, should not claim to be therapists, because I think that's where we get a little bit too much into kind of exploring and connecting because most of us as literary scholars don't understand all the different nuances of PTSD. We don't understand all the different nuances of ADHD, for example. And so it's irresponsible of to all of a sudden start by basically, dissecting a character using a psychoanalytical idea or a psychological idea without proper research. So again, we need to really be responsible when we use this theory. But it does create kind of important aspects to uncover narrative, especially when we think about characters, personalities, psyches, and so forth. We feel that characters are real, right? We love characters. You've gotten into discussions of, oh, that character wouldn't say this or that character changed all of a sudden. So there is something that we subscribe to, that we feel connections to with fictional characters. So these theories kind of help explain why we feel like characters are real or why we relate to characters. So it is an important aspect, but we just have to be responsible. And this, I think, is one of the more dangerous theories because we could use feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, and queer theory without much research. This one requires a huge amount of research to understand. So that would be an important caveat, is make sure you understand what you're talking about. Obviously, this publication can be available in alternative formats, so contact ARC. If you have questions, of course, always post them to the Canvas forum. If not, just good luck with all the assignments and take care.